Yeah.
What was it like gigging around Louisiana when you were younger? I vividly remember you telling me that this one club would pay you in Coca-Cola and fried chicken.
Yeah. It's a funny thing about that. I just started playing. I've been playing maybe a year, about 15. And my cousin, Danny Robichaux, his father was a country musician. He played violin and played the fiddle, very well, country style. Mm-hmm. And they hired me one night to come play, and they started hiring me because I was the only guy in town that didn't use a capo. So I was the only guy in town that didn't matter what key we played in. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was simple music. Simple country music. Ernest Tubb and those kinds of guys.
What brought you out to L.A.?
When I was in school, I was working at a club. There was a club on the West Bank called the Black Knight, and it was upstairs, and it was a showroom, and it used to bring acts into there. Now, I also worked at the Blue Room down, in the city, which they'd bring acts into, more big time acts, like Julie London and people like that at the time. Mm. So there was an act that came in, Freddie Belden and Roberta Lynn. Funny, hell, it was comedy, singing. So they opened a club here in Orange County called the In Place, and they called me out of the blue with Frank Amos, the band leader, who was, I don't know if you know Frank, but he was the Orange County president for a long time. He just passed away about a year ago. Okay. So he called me and said, "Hey, look, they're opening this club. Once you come," he says, "can you find a bass player?" So I had a friend, Jay Setham, who played guitar and bass, and we came out, and I ended up staying.
Wow.
So that's yeah. I came out here December 9th, 1970.
Wow.
Well, man, and tell us about how you got linked up with GIT, and I mean, like, all the cats you were teaching with and hanging with. I mean, that's like a legendary era.
I don't know about that, but that's a pretty good story. I had been working, working around. I worked with Freddie, and I had a top 40 band. My wife and I had a top 40 band together, and I was working at Hungry Joe's, which was a jazz club. 7 nights a week, jazz club down in Huntington Beach.
Wow, 7 nights a week.
But anyway, I went to a Howard Roberts seminar. And I brought a bunch of transcriptions that I did of Howard. And I had known Howard. I met him at a club, and he was like, Howard was my first favorite jazz guitar player. He's the one who ruined my life.
All over.
Anyway, so I bring the transcriptions, and I talked to Pat, and I talked to Howard. Howard said, "Hey, Ron, how you doing?" So I said, "Okay." I said, "Listen, I brought some stuff here that I copied for you." And he said, "Well, why don't you play some of it?" I said, "Okay." So, man, I sat down and just started whipping this stuff out, playing all his solos,
Wow.
And he looked at Pat, and he says, "We need this guy."
Yeah, that's great.
So I said, Howard, would you like to play one of them? He says, "No, I already did."
Oh, man.
When I first came out to L.A., all these guys, Joe Pass and Howard and George Van Epson, all the cats who lived out here, of course I had listened to them my whole life. And, I was exactly right how their personalities were. Mm. Through their playing, I could tell how they were as people. Howard was a real cut-up. There's legendary stories about him in the studio and stuff, coming in at the last minute in the rain on the sandpiper, and they threw all this music in front of him, and he barely got through it. He was a funny cat, man. He was a funny guy.
Today's episode of High Action is sponsored by Henriksen Amplifiers. These guys are great. They're based out in Colorado in the Denver area, and they really build the guitar amplifier designed to meet the needs of the jazz guitar player. We're talking about people that want extremely high quality sound in a portable package. Yeah, their amps are not that heavy, so you can carry them around to the gigs, to your friend's house, wherever you're going. The keys to their success have been manufacturing in their own facilities, keeping their quality control as high as possible, using all analog designs to preserve tonal integrity, 100% commitment to the absolute best customer service in the industry. Believe me, we know these guys, they're great. So check out Henriksen Amps if you want to get a good tone out of your guitars.
So John and Perry, I came up studying with you. John and Perry were studying with Joe Diorio. I imagine you ran into Joe a good amount at GIT.
Oh yeah, well Joe and I, he was at that seminar, and anyway, it ended up being me and Joe and Don Mock from Seattle. That Howard knew real well. He loved Don, and well, you want to talk about somebody play the guitar physically, play the guitar. It was like Diorio. He was amazing.
Wow.
I'd watch these guys play, because I played all the harmony and stuff like that. But I mean, these guys, they play so fast.
And so how did you get linked up with Gene Harris? Some of those albums, I mean, I have most of those albums, and I mean, they're so swinging.
Yeah,
how did you get linked up with Gene?
That's a funny story, too. Gene used to tell that story all the time. Gene picked up Luther in Kentucky, Cincinnati. That's right on the border there from each other. And Carl Burnett, who was his drummer. And anyway, so Luther was working with him, and then Luther and I got to be friends. He was one of the first musicians I met when I came out here. Gene was looking for a guitar player, and Luther just told him, "Hey, man, why don't you call Ronnie?" So the story that Gene says, he says one night, he says, "I heard that there was a white guy who played like a brother down in Orange County." And I'm telling the story where he told it, right?
Yeah.
And he says, I put on my disguise and went down and caught this cat and hired him. So that was that story. I mean, he would lengthen it out, with some funny anecdotes. I can't remember all of it, but it was funny the way he tell the story.
And you traveled all over with Gene. How long were you touring with him?
Well, I played with Gene off and on, basically 21 years off and on. There were years in between that, because as a matter of fact, when I joined Ray Brown Milt Jackson Quartet, I used to, in the late 70s, I started working with Baggs and Brown, and Mickey Roker, so he would use either Monty Alexander or Cedar Walton. He liked playing with guitar every now and then, so he'd hire Ed Bickert every now and then. And then he'd hire me, because I could play the blues and the harmony. I was one of the few guys who could do that. Because in New Orleans, I played on Bourbon Street when I was 18, playing all the Wilson Pickett and James Brown and all that stuff,
Oh, yeah. So Ray Brown, to be part of that scene, what was that like?
I mean, you want to talk about another couple of characters, Ray Brown and Baggs.
You got
They
any
were
fun
some
stories?
funny cats. Brown was a character. We were doing this slow arrangement of Limehouse Blues. And it was way down, bump, do-do-dum. We were doing it. I said, this is a real nice arrangement. He says, oh, yeah. He says, I stole that from Amma Jamma. You didn't call Amma Jamal, called him Amma Jamma, And I said, you stole that from him? And he called me Ash, short for ashtray. In fact, John Clayton and Jeff Hamilton both called me Ash, and so did Milt Jackson. So he looks at me in the only way that, you'd have to be there, the Ray Brown look. He looks down at me and says, hey, Ash, if I'm going to copy something, it ain't going to be no dog ass shit.
At one point, you mentioned Mickey Roker, Gene Harris, Ray Brown. That trio has a great album. Have you heard this album? It's called Red Hot Ray Brown Trio.
Yeah, I heard that years ago. It's been a long time.
It's so great.
Let me tell you the story about that. When I left Baggs, because my son had just been born, and I told Brown, I said, look, I want to get off the road for a while, spend some time with my son, And he said, okay, Ash, who do you think I ought to get? I said, why don't you call Gene Harris? He said, Gene Harris? Yeah. I said, where is Gene? I said, he's up in Boise, Idaho. And so he did. He called Eugene, and Eugene ended up being in the Ray Brown Trio.
Oh, man. That album is so swinging, and it's hard to find. It's kind of like a bootleg. I mean, it's kind of funny. It's hard to find these days. I'd also love to talk about what got you into 7-string guitar playing.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty easy. You know, at the time, I was playing a lot of, not so much solo guitar, but I was playing like with a flute player, trumpet player, singers, and stuff like that. And I was already, you know, since about 1972 playing all those walking bass lines and stuff. Yeah. Now, I mean, a lot of guys do that now, but there were really only me and Ted Green and Joe Pass. We were the only ones playing like the walking bass line thing. So I said, you know, man, if I had another string on here, I said, you know, maybe I'd get a little bit more work, you know? So I did. I did it for that. I did it for that purpose, and it worked out, you know. And that's what ended me putting up the Most Strings band together with me and Todd. You know, he was a student at MI, and I showed him how to play the walking bass lines, you know, with chords, because he had a 6-string, you know, electric bass. And so that was the Most Strings band.
You know, your 7-string playing, I remember sitting in lessons and you would show me something and playing with you. And when you comp with that 7-string, it fills out the sound so much.
Yeah. The thing about that one is, you know, so I tell my students, you know, in actuality, it's easier to play 7-string than it is 6. You know, not so much physically, you know, because you got an extra string to reach for. But chord voicing wise and bass line wise, as far as figured bass, it's much easier to play a 7-string than it's, you know, because I can play an F a low F at your first string. I can play that at the 8th fret. You know what I mean? You know, and all those other voicings I can play and get that bass
You're
line.
right in the middle.
And you know, with a bar, you can play all those same chords. You know, they're not that much different. And since I played a lot of detuning with my classical playing, it was not a problem to deal with the 5th, you know?
I'd love to talk about Steamers a little bit, which you were a huge part of. And I mean, I remember going to see you there all the time, and you were gracious to let me sit in. And, you know, that was a real hang. I think John and Perry actually saw you once or twice at Steamers
all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah. I remember seeing John there at least once, and I think Perry at least once.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, boy, that gig, I was 45 years old when I started there. I worked there basically 20 years, man. You know, almost every first Thursday of the month.
It was a great vibe. It was a great environment for playing. It was a great listening room. And speaking of Todd, bassist Todd Johnson, who I believe is in Arizona now, I want to point out the awesome partnership you guys had in trio playing, where Todd would be playing bass lines and comping a bit while you were soloing.
Right, and then I did the same thing. So that's why I call it the Most Strings band.
Yeah, man. I mean, it sounds really musical and beautiful, and it just sounds very full.
Yeah, Ronnie, man, I'm just loving this. It's just great to touch base, first of all, man. It's really great. This podcast that we're doing, this series of interviews on High Action, we're learning that so many of our guests like you, man, and our teachers like you just come from so many influences and just make you such a melodic player, Ron. And also, you're a fantastic accompanist. I just love playing duo with you. You feel so supported. Do you feel like a lot of your accompaniment skills come from working with so many great vocalists over the years, and like especially the quartet with Gene? I agree with Will. I love that album. Listen Here. You're playing on that track To You is like one of my favorite tracks of all time.
Yeah.
Do you feel like your accompaniment skills comes from playing with a lot of vocalists, because you're so supportive and everything feels right, when you play duo with you, man?